Well, good day, brothers. I've been talking to you about being celibate for the kingdom, and this is the second one of these talks on celibacy. So it's good just to follow that through. I spoke to you last time about the being married to the Lord as a sort of a symbol of the intimacy that we have as celibates with Jesus. A big question that comes up is, will I be fulfilled as a celibate person without the obvious fulfillment that comes through marriage and family life? It's sort of like, does this deny my humanity? A lot of people think that, don't they? They think that if you're celibate, then you're only half human, right? But you see, is it really a denial of humanity? No, it's not. It's an affirmation of one of the deepest meaning of our humanity. Because you can sort of look at, well, okay, I was born, and so I'm born as a man, and I'm born for woman. That's true. But look at the end, what we're destined to be in the future. And when you look at it from the point of view of the future, what we're destined to be, we're destined to be glorified bodily in heaven with one another forever, when marriage is superseded, right? That's the destiny. So if you look at our point of view of our humanity, then we're already moving towards the ultimate fulfillment of our humanity as a celibate man. Because ultimately, of course, what is it to be human? It's to love, isn't it? That's really the key thing. But the normal way, of course, for fulfillment on earth is to become one flesh union in marriage, right? That's the normal way, right? But from this perspective of the end to which we're going, the fundamental vocation that we have as human beings is to be with God forever, right? To be in union with God. That's our fundamental vocation. We become more fully human by knowing and loving God, really. That's what is the depth of our humanity, and the fulfillment of our humanity is not found in relationship with another first and foremost, but it's found in relationship with the Lord, in knowing and loving Him. So in heaven, we'll all be simply knowing and loving God completely. So our mind and our will, our higher faculties, will be totally we'll be knowing the Lord more and more and more forever. We'll be loving the Lord more and more and more forever, right? And we'll be doing that together in union with one another. And that's heaven. And so really the celibate calling really must be fulfilling, because it's already anticipating that purpose that's fundamental to us, to be with God forever in heaven, right? So I don't have a human partner, but our human partner is not our all forever. God is our all forever. For every person, that's right, I mean, so a married couple, that marriage will be as good as it's directed towards God, and each one is actually knowing and loving the Lord. And they're married in the Lord, right, for this earthly journey. But then, of course, until death parts them, right? And then they are taken up into the glory of God forever in heaven with all the rest of us, right? So it's good to sort of understand, have that perspective, that it's actually very fulfilling of our human nature to take on a celibate way of life, if we understand what we're doing, that's out of a desire to know and love and serve the Lord as deeply and as fully as possible. And Jesus does promise 100-fold, as I mentioned to you last time, the fullness of life. And when Jesus says, I've come that you may have life and have it to the full, well, fullness of life is found for everyone who really gives their life to Him, And celibacy, of course, expresses this, that I'm giving my life totally to the Lord, And so consequently, there's 100-fold. As I mentioned last time, when the apostles were asking about that, it's in Luke's gospel. He uses that term, the hundredfold. It's in Luke 18, 29, and it's beautiful to sort of get this into your head too, because we can otherwise sort of be thinking, oh, I'm losing this, I'm not going to have children, I'm not going to be able to have someone who loves me intimately, and all that sort of thing. Peter says, what about us? We left all we had to follow you. I tell you solemnly, Jesus says, that no one has left house, wife, brothers, parents, or children for the sake of the kingdom who will not be given repayment many times over, 100-fold, in this present time and in the world to come. So there's a richness that Jesus promises when we, let go. It mentions there about wife, because Peter had actually left behind his wife. So there's a 100-fold that's available to us if we really take hold of this and really live it fully, right? There's no love, there's no pleasure, there's no delight that to compare with union with God, right? And that's why, of course, the great saints like John of the Cross and others have always experienced that mystical union as a marriage, with the Lord. And ultimately, that's what every human person finds their fulfillment in, marriage with the Lord, not marriage with one another. Even though marriage, of course, is a very beautiful calling for this earthly journey and a wonderful gift of man to woman as God intended it to be. And we must have to be celibate, you've got to have a really strong love for marriage and an appreciation of the gift that marriage is, in the humans. Unfortunately, sometimes in the tradition, celibacy has been sort of raised up as being the perfect way to live, and then marriage is very secondary. I don't think it should be seen that way. There are two different ways of holiness, right? And that needs to be understood. So let's talk then about the needs that we have as human beings, the need for intimacy and the need for generativity. So as a celibate, will I be fulfilled in my need for intimacy? Because that's a basic human need, really. A married couple obviously have the intimacy of one another, sharing life with one another, which reaches its high point, of course, in sexual union, in becoming one flesh in the marital bed. So if that's working really well, then it's a very beautiful way of intimacy. Of course, a lot of times it breaks down, unfortunately, but certainly that's how it's designed. And we're all designed for that way. When you can just have to examine your body, you're designed for union with woman, right? But some, we know, by the grace of God, by this new gospel innovation, some are called to be celibates. But it doesn't mean that you're called to be asexual, that is, like you sort of somehow or other just give up your sexuality. No, celibates are sexual beings. Of course, you can't stop being a sexual being, and it would be do damage to yourself if you tried to be something other than a sexual being. We still have sexual attractions, as others do. We still have a desire for intimacy, as everybody does. But that desire for intimacy as a celibate is expressed differently than as a married person, obviously. But that's a need to know another and to be loved by another, etc. So it's met primarily, of course, for everybody, it's met primarily through prayer, through intimacy with Jesus, really. And when the Lord calls a man to be celibate, he's going to give you a special grace of intimacy with Jesus, right? It doesn't mean that only celibates can become saints. But what you'll notice down through the tradition is a lot of celibates did become saints, right? And the church is trying to find more married couples to sort of honor them as saints too, of course. Like Therese Lisieux's parents, they're honored now as saints, or at least as blesseds. And certainly that's good and affirming, but there's no doubt about there's something about the celibate calling because of the radical nature of the celibate calling. If it's lived well, mind you, and sometimes it's been lived very poorly, unfortunately, but if it's lived well, if it's lived under God's grace, it brings people into a deep, intimate union with the Lord, because all the other preoccupations just sort of slip away, and people can come into a deep place with the Lord. So that's very important then to understand that need to love and to be loved is fulfilled primarily in your intimacy with Jesus. So that's why a celibate must have times aside in silence and solitude. They're very important to be alone with the Lord, because He's the love of your life, and you've got to be alone with Him. Allow Him to fill up your heart and fill up your life with His light and His love. But of course, you will experience loneliness. But I've talked to married couples, and they get lonely too. Loneliness is part of the human condition. But there is a particular loneliness that will come to a celibate, of course. But that's a loneliness that doesn't have to be negative and debilitating. But it's a loneliness that is an invitation to lean into the Lord, to lean into Him. And just like John the Beloved at the Last Supper, leaning into intimacy with the Lord and listening to His heartbeat, as it were, that's that invitation, deepening in a loving dependency on the Lord and finding our lasting joy in Him, right? So that's the invitation. The loneliness that can ache at times, you'll feel that ache of loneliness because naturally you're built for union with woman, and you won't have that. But that's not experienced ultimately as a sort of a negative thing. Sometimes you'll have times when you feel the craving, but that can be experienced very positively as long as you lean into the Lord. But also I think it's important to express too that we are, of course, obviously, you can't touch the Lord, as it were. And so we do need human intimacy, right? And so that's where human connectedness is really important for a celibate. Like a down-to-earth brotherhood is really important. That's why our brotherhood will always have brothers together in mission, not by themselves, because they need to be able to share with one another, talk with one another, sort of laugh with one another, someone to come home to, rather than to come home to an empty house, as it were, right? So that will require like trust, acceptance, and respect in the brotherhood, where you can find like a community of tenderness, a community of where human affection is present. There's a balanced life, and you can establish healthy friendships, etc. So that's like in the context of the brotherhood. It's really important to have a brotherhood where that's a sense of belonging, a sense of being at home, where you can share and be yourself, and people ask you how your day's going and that sort of thing. So it's sort of like there's an intimacy of that kind. There's all sorts of different types of intimacy. There's work intimacy. There's sort of emotional intimacy. There's intimacy in sharing beauty together, or whatever. There's all sorts of different types of intimacy, and the only intimacy that we don't have as a celibate, of course, is genital intimacy, right? And which is inappropriate to our state of life. So it's important that we do have intimacy. It's important that's not deprived. If a celibate deprives himself of intimacy by just living a lonely, sort of crabby life, then he becomes a very sort of incommunicative type of person, hard to get on with, and is not very useful for the kingdom of God, really. But he needs to be warm and friendly and relational, etc., which comes from being in relationship with other people, right? Rather than sort of like cut off and isolated, etc. So that connection is really important. And see, with the missionaries of God's love, it really helps us to belong to the disciples of Jesus community, because we have ongoing relationships with married couples and families, etc., and other singles, but all together in a life of community. So that's a good context in which guys can grow in the celibate life, right? So that their psychosexual development can take place well, rather than being sort of like some or other cut off in just an all-male environment just by themselves, right? So we need then to have ways of turning our love towards others in relationship. Things go wrong when we aren't outward focused, but just focused on ourselves, etc., and you end up turning to porn or to masturbation or something like that as a very poor sort of way of fulfilling the deep needs, right, for intimacy. And so it's important that we, have good relationships with the brothers, good relationships with friends outside the brotherhood as well, good relationships in the community around us. That sort of leads to a very balanced way of being a celibate, which is really important. So, and then of course, in serving others too is really important, that my life is given in service. So while I'll have times aside just with the Lord, I'll have times just of celebration with the brothers and sort of having good brotherhood time together in recreation, but I'll also be committed in service, because our energies for love, we're talking about here, are meant to be sort of spent on others, So we're other-centered. We're not sort of just centered on ourselves and our own needs, etc., but we're centered on other people. So celibacy shines best when we're, given in self-sacrificing love for others, and especially for the poor. So there's just sort of talking around this sort of concept of really knowing there's a deep need for intimacy, but that doesn't have to be a game changer for you. If you really allow the love of the Lord to be present within you, find a life of prayer, and also being in relationship with the brothers, knowing you have a place where you belong, you're at home, where you're affirmed and built up and strengthened, where you're listened to, and then you also have a sort of a servant heart as well, really, being able to serve others, and in that way sort of giving your life. So it's about love and it's about life, right? So what about the generativity part, right? Because what you find is that when you're sort of going through your first experience of celibacy, maybe in your early years, say your late teens or early 20s, maybe the dominant thing is going to be like looking for genital intimacy. You sort of have a drive strongly there. You're looking for that sort of satisfaction. Then as you go into your later 20s, you tend to be sort of more looking for intimate relationship, right? And so you're looking for friendship that will sort of like express your, be able to express, known to be known, to be loved and to be loved. That's the intimacy crisis. But then there's a further thing as you go on in years. It's about generativity. What's the legacy I'm going to leave behind? But also like this energy within me for love and for life. How am I going to if I'm not going to have children, that's a generative thing, isn't it? Have children, and then to teach them and to form them and prepare them for their lives, etc. That's a parenting thing. If I'm not going to have that in my life, then how is it going to be? I'm not going to be procreating and be generative with children. Then this nurturing instinct within me, how is it going to be, brought forward? Because some people think, celibacy is really sterile, it's unfruitful, you're just living a wasted life. No, it's a beautiful opportunity to beget many children in the faith, So it's being generative in that way, right? Being fruitful in that way. Fruitfulness of the spirit, not of the body. And we become real fathers and real mothers in a very real sort of way. Now, Paul experienced this. Remember, Paul, he's actually celibate, right? Remember that, deliberately celibate. So 1 Corinthians 4:15, he says this. He's talking to the Corinthians. He says, you might have thousands of guardians in Christ, but not more than one father. He's talking about himself, because he's the one who fathered them, you see, into life in the Spirit. And it was I who begot you in Christ Jesus by preaching the good news. I begot you. He says, you're my begotten children. He's saying, I preached the good news to you. I brought life to you in this way. So now I'm your father. I'm your guardian. You need to listen to me. That's what he's saying to them, right? And then also in Galatians 4:19, we get a similar thing presented as well, where Paul is talking to the Galatians and he's not very happy with them, you see. He's correcting them. He says, "My children, must I go through the pain of giving birth to you all over again?" So he says, I gave birth to you by preaching the gospel to you, and now you've gone the wrong way. Must I go through the pain of giving birth to you all over again? Right? So you see, he understands himself as being very productive, very generative, right, in this regard. And again in 1 Thessalonians as well, he says to them, "You can remember how we treated every one of you as a father treats his children, teaching you what was right, encouraging you, and appealing to you to live a life worthy of God." So again, treat as a father treats his children, you see. So my dear friends, you will have many, if you become a celibate, you'll have many children. I have countless children, in the faith, who I take such joy in, not that they're mine, as it were, they belong to the Lord, but I've been able to be an instrument of the Lord in birthing them into the faith, and then discipling them and caring for them and nurturing them in a way that sort of builds them up in God. And then take such joy when I see them doing such wonderful works for God and for his kingdom. I think, oh Lord, thank you that you used me this way. That's generativity, my friends. That's the generativity of the celibate. And you'll have many like that if you have a full life in God, So yeah, that's my main pitch, that celibacy then, it does fulfill these two natural needs, the need to love and the need to give life, right? The need to love and to be loved, and the need to be generative. So the first one's the need for intimacy, second one's the need for generativity. Both those needs get fulfilled by the celibate, who is actually really faithful to God and the calling that's been given to him, and lives out the grace richly. Of course, he can try and cheat on the whole thing, and so try and fulfill his intimacy need in the wrong way. There's always a temptation to do that. There's also a temptation to fulfill the generative need in the wrong way as well, But no, we can really take hold of this grace that God gives us, just like Paul did. See how Paul really loved being celibate. It was a radical way to live, and he wanted to live that radical way of love. So you too are invited to that as well. So I trust that you will consider this very carefully and place yourself before the Lord and his calling upon your life. Bless his name.